The forest floor groaned beneath a shroud of mist, thick and cloying, muffling every sound save the erratic thumping of a distant woodpecker and the rapid hammering of his own pulse. A chill, damp and ancient, seeped into his bones, not entirely from the Pacific Northwest air, but from something deeper, a primal unease that prickled the hairs on his neck. He wasn't alone. He knew it with an animal certainty that bypassed logic, a feeling that had become an unwelcome companion since he'd retreated to this wilderness. The air itself seemed heavy, pregnant with an unseen presence. A branch snapped, not with a sharp crack of a deer bounding away, but with a deliberate, almost resonant thwack that vibrated through the soles of his worn hiking boots. Then, silence. A profound, absolute silence that swallowed the woodpecker, the wind, even the buzzing of insects. It was the kind of silence that screams. He stood perfectly still, breath held, eyes straining against the limited visibility, trying to pierce the shifting veil of white. What was it? A bear? A cougar? His mind, trained for decades in the meticulous dissection of primate behavior, wrestled with the instinctual terror, trying to categorize, to rationalize. But this was different. This felt aware. It was a sensation he'd experienced before. Fleeting glimpses, peripheral movements, inexplicable alterations to the landscape around his remote cabin. It was the whisper of a legend, the shadow of a myth, the unsettling presence people whispered about in hushed tones. Sasquatch. Dr. Eris Thorne, late 40s but looking 50-something. A man whose once sharp academic eyes now carried the permanent weight of profound sorrow, slowly exhaled the cold, damp air. He was a primatologist by training, or rather had been. His reputation, once built on controversial but groundbreaking theories regarding the cognitive abilities of great apes, had since splintered, leaving him largely an academic pariah. He'd traded bustling university labs and respectful lecture halls for this isolated existence, a cabin perched precariously on the edge of an immense, unforgiving wilderness. The move had been born of necessity, a desperate attempt to outrun a grief that gnawed at his soul. His family, his wife, his young daughter, gone. Vanished without a trace during a recreational hike several years prior, swallowed by these very woods. The official report cited an accidental fall, perhaps an animal attack, but no bodies were ever found. No definitive evidence to quell the gnawing what if. The tragedy had unmoored him, shattering his tightly controlled scientific worldview and leaving him susceptible to theories once dismissed as fringe. Now, his days were a regimented routine of solitary research and quiet contemplation, punctuated by long, rambling forays into the ancient forest that bordered his property. His academic career, already faltering, had effectively flatlined. His peers, once colleagues, now viewed him with a mixture of pity and professional disdain, whispering about his increasingly unorthodox research interests. They spoke of his quiet obsession with cryptozoology, a derogatory term in their esteemed circles, as evidence of a mind unraveling. But Eris didn't care. The wilderness offered a brutal honesty his former life lacked, and here, amongst the towering firs and the endless quiet, he found a fractured peace, occasionally punctuated by moments like this, moments that stirred a deep, almost forbidden curiosity. It had started subtly, weeks ago. A series of oddly arranged stones near the old deer trail at the back of his property, not just a random pile, but large, heavy rocks, clearly moved, forming a rough, deliberate circle. He'd initially dismissed it as a local teenager's prank, or perhaps an idiosyncratic bear's den marking. He'd even considered the possibility of a geological anomaly, however unlikely. But then, a few days later, several thick branches, too high for any human to reach without climbing gear, had been snapped clean off sturdy trees, neatly stacked into a lean-to formation less than a mile deeper into his land. The breaks were fresh, the wood still green and fibrous, not weather-worn. This was beyond a bear's capabilities, beyond a prank. This was a pattern. The arrangement of the rocks, the deliberate placement of the branches. It spoke of intent, a language without words. Over the next few weeks, the discoveries escalated. Small saplings twisted into impossible knots. Large boulders seemingly rolled into precise alignments, even sections of undergrowth meticulously cleared in unnatural geometric shapes that defied explanation. It wasn't vandalism. It was too subtle, too methodical. It wasn't natural. The effort involved was immense, beyond any known animal. Each new finding chipped away at his scientific skepticism, forcing him to confront the inconvenient truth. Something intelligent, something powerful, was intentionally altering his environment. It wasn't malicious, not overtly, but it was undeniably present, a silent architect reshaping the world around his shrinking island of rationality. The events unsettled him, reigniting the primal fear, but also fueling a forgotten spark of scientific inquiry. This wasn't just a random act, it was a conversation, albeit one he didn't yet understand. He began meticulously cataloging every anomaly, sketching the formations, measuring distances, tracking patterns. His research, once confined to dusty textbooks and lab reports, had spilled out into the sprawling, enigmatic canvas of the forest itself. The academic world might have cast him out, but the wilderness, in its own cryptic way, was inviting him in. It was a call, a silent beckoning from the depths of the unknown, hinting at a truth far grander and more terrifying than he had ever dared to imagine. He felt a burgeoning realization, a chilling certainty that these subtle alterations were not mere coincidences, but deliberate messages, left by something that remembered, something that was trying to communicate. And as his finger traced the rough bark of a tree where another impossibly broken branch dangled, he knew he had to answer. If you're captivated by stories that push the boundaries of what we know and delve into the mysteries hidden just beyond our perception, make sure to hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss a single chapter of this extraordinary journey or any of our other intriguing tales. The deliberate arrangements continued, pushing Dr. Eris Thorne beyond mere fascination into a realm of systematic observation. He purchased an array of sophisticated equipment, motion-activated cameras with infrared capabilities, and highly sensitive sound recorders, strategically placing them throughout his sprawling property and the bordering wilderness. The initial days yielded little beyond the usual forest dwellers. Deer, bears, the occasional cougar, all moving with the predictable rhythms of their species. But then, after almost 2 weeks of patient waiting, the raw data began to reveal anomalies. The cameras, triggered by movement too large for a deer, yet too subtle for a bear's lumbering gait, captured fleeting glimpses, blurry shapes, hulking figures, moving with impossible speed and grace at the extreme edge of the frame, often partially obscured by dense foliage or the deep shadows of dusk and dawn. These weren't glimpses of a prankster or a rare bear. The sheer scale, the bipedal locomotion, the fleeting yet undeniable impression of immense power spoke of something else entirely. Simultaneously, the audio recorders picked up faint, low-frequency vocalizations that defied categorization. They were not the howls of wolves, the hoot of an owl, or the growl of a bear. These were deep, resonant pulses, almost infrasonic, carrying an unsettling weight, a primal hum that seemed to vibrate through the very earth itself. Thorne spent hours analyzing the spectrograms, comparing them to known animal sounds, to human vocalizations, to everything he could find in biological sound libraries. Nothing matched. These were unique. Beyond the sensory inputs, the physical evidence also intensified. He found more of the unusual botanical samples, carefully arranged. Not just broken branches, but specific types of moss intertwined with particular twigs, or clusters of wildflowers meticulously placed atop flat stones. Some arrangements seemed almost decorative, while others possessed a stark, functional symmetry. He carefully collected samples, cross-referencing them with local flora, noting patterns in their selection and placement. These findings challenged his well-honed scientific understanding, pushing at the boundaries of what he believed possible in the natural world. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, intelligent, and deeply mysterious. As Thorne's home became a makeshift laboratory, overflowing with cables, monitors, and collected specimens, the wider world began to echo his growing unease. Local news channels, often dismissed as sensationalist fodder, started carrying reports of unusual disappearances in the vast wilderness surrounding the region. Hikers vanished without a trace, hunters failed to return, and even experienced prospectors, intimate with the treacherous terrain, simply ceased to exist. Authorities, predictably, attributed these tragedies to the unforgiving nature of the mountains. Sudden weather changes, accidental falls, or encounters with aggressive wildlife. Yet, Thorne couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. The reports often included anecdotal mentions of strange cries heard before a disappearance, high-pitched wails or deep guttural roars that terrified witnesses. These sounds, described by frightened locals, resonated ominously with the low-frequency vocalizations he was now meticulously documenting. A cold dread began to seep into Thorne's resolve, mingling with the scientific curiosity that had initially driven him. The news reports, the strange cries, the inexplicable vanishing acts, they stirred a deeply buried, exquisitely painful memory. His own family's disappearance years ago had been dismissed as an unexplained hiking accident. The official story provided no closure, only a gaping void. Now, as he sifted through reports of similar tragedies, a chilling hypothesis began to form. Could these events, the ones happening now and the one that shattered his life, be connected? Was there an intelligent, powerful, and deeply reclusive force operating in these woods? A force unknown to mainstream science, capable of such profound effects? The thought both terrified and galvanized him. He felt a growing sense of urgency, a pressing need to understand, not just for scientific advancement, but for a deeply personal reckoning. One twilight evening, while checking a remote camera trap nestled deep within a particularly ancient stand of cedars, Thorne had his first undeniable, terrifying, yet profoundly ambiguous encounter. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. A sudden, sharp crack of a branch behind him shattered the silence. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, his breath catching. For a fraction of a second, an eternity condensed into a blink, he saw it. A towering, ape-like creature, swathed in dark, shaggy fur, stood half obscured by the thick trunk of a giant cedar, less than 50 feet away. Its immense form exuded a raw, untamed power, yet it held itself with an almost regal stillness. For that fleeting moment, their eyes met. Not the vacant stare of a wild animal, nor the aggressive challenge of a predator, but something far more complex. There was intelligence, ancient and deep, held within those dark, watchful eyes. And beneath the intelligence, he perceived a flash of something else, something he couldn't quite articulate then. A flicker of profound sadness, perhaps, or an echo of recognition. A primal connection, an unexpected sense of kinship surged through him, an almost unbearable weight of shared understanding. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature dissolved into the deepening shadows, vanishing without a sound, leaving Thorn alone, trembling, his scientific detachment utterly shattered. The encounter left him with far more questions than answers, a terrifying confirmation overlaid with an unsettling sense of recognition he couldn't explain. He was no longer just an observer. He had been seen. He had been acknowledged. And in that quiet, shadowed forest, the world had fundamentally shifted on its axis. Thorn, now fully consumed by the enigma, dedicated every waking hour to a deeper investigation. The fleeting glimpse, the electrifying moment of recognition, had irrevocably shifted his scientific paradigm. He was no longer merely observing an unknown primate. He was trying to understand a sophisticated, elusive intelligence. His cabin transformed into an archive of the strange, a repository of indigenous folklore, dusty anthropological texts, and hastily scribbled notes. He devoured ancient narratives of forest giants, spirit guardians, and the wild man of the woods from cultures across the globe, searching for echoes, for commonalities that might illuminate his own experiences. He identified recurring patterns that transcended geographical boundaries. The specific plant arrangements he'd found on his land, for instance, mirrored descriptions in old Ojibwe tales of medicine signs left by forest beings. The unique vocalizations captured on his sound recorders, once dismissed as animal calls, now had unsettling parallels in accounts of warning cries or mourning songs from Pacific Northwest tribes. Even the distinct territorial markers, often intricate branch weaves or stacked stones, resonated with anthropological studies of symbolic communication in early human societies. He sought out obscure academic papers, often self-published or relegated to the fringes of mainstream primatology, that dared to explore non-human symbolic thought. His peers would have scoffed, but Thorn felt he was finally closing in on something profound. Through painstaking analysis of these collected vocalizations and behavioral patterns, a radical hypothesis began to form in Thorn's mind. These creatures, Sasquatch, as he now dared to call them without irony, possessed a form of complex communication, far beyond instinctual calls, and perhaps even a developed capacity for memory. He spent hours meticulously categorizing the recorded sounds, isolating distinct tones, rhythms, and variations. One particular vocalization pattern, a series of elongated, melancholic notes followed by a guttural sigh, resonated deeply. It didn't sound like a warning, nor a territorial claim. It sounded, unmistakably, like a lament, a profound, aching sound that seemed to carry the weight of ages, a sonic memory of something tragically lost. He replayed it endlessly, his own heart aching in sympathy, a strange communion across species. This realization about their potential for memory was a watershed moment. If they could remember, what did they remember? What experiences, what historical consciousness underpinned that sorrowful cry? He felt a new urgency, a desire not just to understand them scientifically, but emotionally. His breakthrough came unexpectedly, not from a recording or a text, but from a tangible artifact. While tracking a faint, familiar scent through a particularly dense section of old-growth forest, he stumbled upon an older, remarkably well-preserved nest or shelter. Unlike the temporary bedding spots he'd seen before, this was clearly designed for long-term occupation. It was an ingeniously woven structure of interlocking branches and moss, camouflaged perfectly against the ancient cedars. Inside, protected from the elements, were crude but undeniable carvings. On a smooth piece of slate, nestled in the damp earth, were a series of scratched lines and circles. Adjacent to it, a fallen cedar branch, its bark worn smooth over time, bore similar markings. They weren't art in the human sense, not representations of animals or people, but rather abstract patterns, sequences that repeated and varied. Some looked like tally marks, others like constellations or simplified maps. This wasn't merely instinctual behavior. This was a deliberate act of creation, suggesting intelligence and, crucially, symbolic thought. Thorn ran his fingers over the ancient marks, a shiver tracing its way down his spine. These weren't random scratches. They were symbols, perhaps a primitive form of writing, a record-keeping, or even storytelling. They were evidence of minds capable of abstraction, of communicating ideas beyond the immediate present. The lament he'd heard so many times seemed to echo in the quiet stillness of the shelter. These creatures weren't just animals. They were beings with a history, with memories, and with the capacity to express them. The implications were staggering, rewriting everything he thought he knew about primate evolution and the very definition of intelligence on Earth. He felt he was standing on the precipice of a discovery that would shake the foundations of science, a secret kept hidden in the deepest, most ancient parts of the forest. The carvings were a silent scream across time, a testament to a complex inner life that humanity had, for centuries, stubbornly refused to acknowledge. Thorn traced the final contour of a strange, spiral carving, his mind racing with a profound new hypothesis. This wasn't merely evidence of intelligence. It was a revelation that shattered his previous understanding. The intricate patterns, the sorrowful depth of their vocalizations, the deliberate arrangements of plants and rocks. All these disparate pieces coalesced into a radical theory. Sasquatch once coexisted more openly with humans, and crucially, they possessed a deep, enduring memory of this shared ancient past. The carvings, the melancholic calls, even the careful botanical arrangements near his cabin were not random occurrences. They were coded messages, perhaps even desperate attempts to rekindle a lost connection, an almost forgotten dialogue. He now believed they remembered periods of interaction, perhaps even friendship or a symbiotic relationship with early human ancestors, a time before fear and misunderstanding drove them into the deepest shadows. This theory, nascent yet incredibly compelling, pulsed with an almost spiritual energy within him. He saw their actions not as mere animal instinct, but as echoes of a bygone era, mnemonic devices designed to bridge vast chasms of time and silence. They remembered us, he was convinced, and they were trying, in their own subtle and profound way, to remind us of that shared lineage, that forgotten bond. The implications were staggering, undermining centuries of scientific dogma that relegated such creatures to myth or simple, instinct-driven beasts. Driven by this conviction, Thorn attempted to share his burgeoning findings. He reached out to former colleagues, those few who had once respected his unconventional intellect. He presented his analysis of the vocalizations, the detailed photographs of the carvings, his meticulous notes on the arranged artifacts. The response was a chilling wall of polite dismissal, quickly followed by outright ridicule. Emails went unanswered, phone calls were rerouted, and eventually, academic doors slammed shut. He was labeled a crackpot, a man who had finally succumbed to the wilderness neurosis that sometimes afflicted isolated researchers. Whispers of delusion followed him, and thinly veiled threats to revoke his remaining research funding materialized. His theories were too outlandish, too far removed from accepted primatology, too entangled with what they sneeringly called cryptozoological fantasy. He was already an outcast, and this only cemented his isolation, pushing him further to the fringes of the scientific community he had once sought to enlighten. Yet this external opposition, rather than deterring him, only intensified his resolve. Their skepticism, their fear of the unknown, merely underscored the profundity of his discovery. He knew he was on the right path, and he knew he had to prove it. Undeterred by the academic scorn, Thorne turned his full attention to meticulously documenting every shred of evidence supporting the memory aspect of his theory. He spent weeks observing the perimeter of his property with renewed focus, not just searching for creatures, but for those careful, deliberate signs, those unspoken messages. And the evidence began to mount, undeniable and deeply personal. He noticed the creatures were indeed leaving specific items near his cabin, often in the same spots he had previously found the arranged rocks. These were not just random forest debris. They were small, polished stones, smoothed by water or friction, their surfaces occasionally bearing faint, natural patterns that almost resembled symbols. Sometimes he would find unique feathers, vibrant in color or unusual in texture, meticulously placed on his porch or beside the well. Once near his woodpile, he discovered a small, intricately woven bundle of plant fibers, almost like a miniature basket, containing a handful of dried berries. These were not offerings in a traditional sense, not food or sacrifice. They felt more intimate, more communicative. He hypothesized these were indeed mnemonic devices, tactile reminders, perhaps even attempts to engage in a reciprocal exchange of symbolic objects. They were gifts, yes, but gifts laden with meaning, echoes of a shared past, and a yearning for renewed connection. He began to leave small, carefully selected items in return. Smooth river stones, a polished piece of driftwood, a small, brightly colored berry. He never saw them taken, never witnessed the exchange, but the next morning, his offering would be gone, and another, equally significant item would be left in its place. This silent, almost sacred exchange became a crucial part of his daily routine. It was a language without words, a tentative bridge being built across centuries of misunderstanding. He felt a growing sense of responsibility, a profound understanding that he was witnessing something extraordinary, a dialogue resurrected from the depths of time. The Sasquatch, with their quiet gestures, were revealing a depth of memory and a capacity for communication that defied all conventional scientific classification. They remembered, undeniably. The next pressing question, a heavy weight that began to settle in his soul, was why, if they remembered so vividly, had they stopped trying to communicate more openly? What had caused such a profound, lasting rift between their species and ours? That question gnawed at him, demanding an answer, a truth buried beneath layers of history and fear. The discovery of the carvings, those primitive yet profound symbols, had solidified Thorne's radical theory. Sasquatch remembered. They possessed a deep generational memory, a historical consciousness that transcended mere instinct. The melancholic vocalizations, the deliberate arrangements of natural objects, the sophisticated construction of their shelters, all pointed to a capacity for complex thought and a connection to a past that humans had long dismissed as myth. He understood, with a clarity that both exhilarated and terrified him, that these beings were not simply surviving. They were enduring, carrying the weight of centuries of shared experience. But as the understanding of that memory settled within him, a new, more unsettling question began to surface, gnawing at his mind with relentless persistence. If they remembered, and if that memory once included a period of open interaction with humans, then why had they stopped trying to connect? Why the profound reclusiveness, the almost ghostly avoidance that defined their current existence? What catastrophic event, what monumental disillusionment had forced such a vibrant, complex intelligence into the deepest shadows of the wilderness? He started to observe their current behavior with renewed focus, filtering everything through this newly framed question. Their movements were not just stealthy, they were calculated, designed to avoid any prolonged human detection. Their territories, while vast, seemed to contract instinctively at the slightest hint of human encroachment. There was a palpable wariness in every sign they left, a deep-seated fear that permeated their existence. It wasn't the natural caution of a wild animal. It was the learned behavior of a species that had been hunted, persecuted, and betrayed. His research shifted from proving their memory to uncovering the catalyst for their retreat. The wilderness around him, once a place of scientific fascination, transformed into an archive of unspoken history. He delved deeper into local archives, beyond the academic texts and indigenous folklore, turning his attention to forgotten historical records. He spent long nights poring over brittle, yellowed newspaper clippings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, scouring old county records, and even examining dusty accounts from early logging camps. The answers began to emerge, slowly at first, then with a horrifying momentum. He uncovered fragmented but consistent reports of what were then referred to as wild men, giant ape men, or forest devils. These weren't isolated sightings. They were accounts embedded in the fabric of early settler life. But what followed these sightings was deeply disturbing, fueled by a combination of fear, misunderstanding, and a frontier mentality that viewed anything untamed as a threat to be eradicated. A systematic, brutal hunting campaign had been waged. There were chilling, almost casual mentions of expeditions organized to clear the woods of these nuisances. Accounts spoke of groups of armed men tracking and killing these creatures, often with ruthless efficiency. The narrative was always triumphalist, painting the settlers as brave conquerors of the wild, and the wild men as savage obstacles to progress. Thorne felt a cold dread settle in his stomach as he read account after account of mass killings. Not just individuals, but entire family groups targeted. The destruction wasn't confined to the creatures themselves. Their natural habitats were razed by aggressive logging, their food sources decimated, their traditional territories fragmented. The reports described drives, where these beings were herded, trapped, and slaughtered, their bodies often left unburied, a grim warning to any others who dared to linger. This was not just encroachment. It was an active extermination, driven by a fear that bordered on hysteria. The turning point in his understanding came in the form of a small, leather-bound journal, discovered almost by accident in the dusty archives of an obscure historical society. It was the personal diary of a territorial ranger named Elias Vance, dating back to 1903. Vance was a gruff, laconic man, fiercely dedicated to what he saw as the impartial justice of the law, but his entries held a raw, unvarnished truth. In a series of increasingly agitated entries, Vance recounted his participation in one such hunting expedition, initially convinced he was ridding the wilderness of a dangerous threat. But then came the entry that ripped through Thorne's carefully constructed scientific detachment, chilling him to the bone. Vance described the massacre of a Sasquatch family, not just adults, but juveniles, cornered and cut down with rifles. The ranger's subsequent entries were filled with a profound and agonizing guilt, a stark reversal from his earlier conviction. He wrote of the intelligent, pleading eyes of a female Sasquatch as she tried to shield her young, of the mournful cries that echoed long after the gunshots ceased. Vance confessed to nightmares, to an overwhelming sense of shame, and to his growing conviction that what they had done was an unspeakable atrocity against intelligent, sentient beings. He spoke of the saddest sound I ever heard, a lament that haunted his waking hours, remarkably similar to the one Thorne had identified in his own recordings. Vance's final entry, scrawled in a shaky hand, described his resignation, his inability to continue serving a system that sanctioned such barbarity, and his belief that humanity had committed an unforgivable betrayal. He posited that these creatures, if they survived, would never again trust mankind. This journal, this single heart-wrenching testimony, and provided the horrifying, undeniable answer to why they stopped trying to connect. It wasn't simple shyness or natural reclusiveness. It was trauma. It was the deep, scarring wound of human violence and treachery that had forced them into hiding. They remembered the shared past, yes, but they also remembered the brutal consequence of that interaction. They remembered the massacres, the destruction, the fear. They had learned, through unimaginable suffering, that humanity was not to be trusted. That connection led only to annihilation. The forest became their sanctuary, not just by choice, but by urgent necessity, a vast green cloak to conceal their existence from the species that had once hunted them to the brink of extinction. Thorne felt a wave of profound sorrow and a searing anger wash over him, realizing the immense, silent cost of human ignorance and cruelty perpetuated for generations. The weight of the old journal, brittle and stained with time, pressed heavily against Thorne's chest, its contents scorching his mind far more deeply than any physical burn. The ranger's meticulous, if regretful, entries detailed not merely a singular event, but a sustained, brutal eradication effort, a campaign of fear-driven violence that painted the forest crimson. He saw it all laid bare. The methodical tracking, the crude traps, the relentless hounding of a species simply trying to exist. The casual cruelty of men, masked by fear and ignorance, echoed through the yellowed pages, a chilling testament to humanity's capacity for destruction. This wasn't merely a historical footnote. It was a wound, festering and deep, that explained everything. The reclusiveness, the fear, the near invisibility of the Sasquatch. It all clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. A profound sorrow washed over him, a cold tide that crept into the deepest corners of his soul. He connected this historical violence instinctively to his own family's disappearance, a sickening lurch in his gut. Could it be? Could his wife and daughter have been caught in some renewed, desperate conflict? Their innocent presence misinterpreted by creatures scarred by generations of human aggression? Had the Sasquatch, remembering the brutal lessons of the past, simply seen them as another threat, another wave of invaders? The thought was a dagger to his heart, twisting with an unbearable guilt. Humanity had broken this trust, shattered this ancient peace, and his family might have paid the ultimate price for the sins of others. The weight of that collective responsibility, the realization of humanity's indelible role in their isolation, pressed down on him, a crushing burden. He saw not just the Sasquatch as victims, but his own kin as unwitting casualties in a war they didn't even know was being waged, a war born of human cruelty. The scientific detachment he'd once prided himself on shattered, replaced by an overwhelming need for something more profound than mere observation. He couldn't simply study them anymore. He had to try and heal, to bridge the chasms his own species had created. His approach shifted radically. Out went the sterile scientific methodologies, the cameras, the recorders, the dispassionate distance. In came a new, deeply personal endeavor, an attempt at reconciliation. He began leaving offerings, not as experiments, but as gestures of peace, mirroring the Sasquatch's own enigmatic gifts. His first offerings were simple, almost childlike in their earnestness. Bowls of wild berries, gathered from the sun-drenched clearings, placed carefully on moss-covered rocks they favored. He polished smooth river stones until they gleamed, arranging them in intricate patterns he'd seen reproduced in ancient folklore, hoping they might resonate. He wove intricate baskets from supple willow branches and dried grasses, leaving them filled with fragrant herbs and nuts. Each offering was placed with meticulous care, accompanied by soft, hummed melodies, ancient folk tunes, simple lullabies, anything that might convey a sense of calm and peaceful intent, a stark contrast to the gunfire and shouts that had once driven them to silence. He spoke aloud, his voice low and soothing, explaining his intentions, offering apologies, hoping that somehow, some fundamental understanding might transcend language barriers. "I'm not here to hurt you," he would whisper to the silent forest. "I remember too. I want to understand." Weeks turned into a slow, almost agonizing test of patience. At first, his offerings remained untouched, a testament to the deep-seated wariness he was trying to overcome. He encountered moments of discouragement, flashes of doubt that this enterprise was utterly futile. Then, subtle changes began to manifest. A basket of berries would vanish, replaced by a single, perfectly balanced feather. A polished stone he'd left would be found nestled amongst a cluster of unique, fragrant mosses. There was no direct interaction, no sudden appearance, and no dramatic breakthrough. But the offerings were taken. The invisible barrier, built over centuries of mistrust and terror, was slowly, painstakingly, beginning to erode. He began to feel a profound sense of connection, not just with the elusive beings, but with the forest itself. He learned its rhythms, its murmurs, recognizing the rustle of a hidden creature versus the whisper of the wind. He found himself moving with a new quietness, his footsteps lighter, his senses attuned to the subtle shifts in the woodland air. It was a dance, a silent, ancient courtship of trust. He felt their presence more acutely now, a peripheral awareness that sent shivers down his spine, not of fear but of anticipation. He knew they were watching him, observing his every move, deliberating, perhaps even debating amongst themselves whether this one human, this lone anomaly, was truly different from the others who had come before. One evening, after leaving a meticulously arranged pile of medicinal herbs, he returned to his cabin to find a small, intricate carving left on his porch swing. Not crude like the ancient ones, but delicate and precise, depicting a leaf he recognized as unique to the deepest parts of their territory. It wasn't a human leaf, but something stylized, symbolic. His heart pounded with a mixture of terror and elation. They weren't just taking, they were communicating back. The barrier wasn't just eroding, it was becoming porous. He stood there for a long time, the cool night air prickling his skin, holding the small carving, a tangible sign of a possible future, a fragile hope blossoming in the vast, shadowed wilderness. The cautious interaction had begun. The morning mist still clung to the ancient cedars, painting the forest in hues of gray and emerald as Thorn ventured deeper than usual. an unusual urgency guiding his steps. He'd woken with an inexplicable feeling, a prickle of unease that settled stubbornly in his gut. The air, usually filled with the cheerful chorus of early birds, was eerily quiet, save for the distant, persistent cawing of a raven, a sound he now associated with warning. He carried his usual field kit: binoculars, a small first aid pouch, a multi-tool, and a bag of carefully selected wild berries and nuts, ready for another offering. But today felt different. The path, if one could call it that, was marked by a series of unusually fresh indicators. Not the subtle, almost invisible signs he'd learned to decipher, but clearer, more deliberate breakages of branches, scuff marks on the damp earth that spoke of hurried movement. He recognized them as Sasquatch markers, but these seemed to convey agitation rather than mere passage. Following the trail deeper into a dense thicket he rarely frequented, a place where the canopy was so thick that sunlight struggled to pierce through, Thorn suddenly stopped. A faint, whimper-like sound reached his ears, carried on the still air. It was a sound he'd never heard from them before. Not a vocalization of communication, but of pain, raw and desperate. His heart leaped into his throat. He pushed aside a curtain of ferns, his breath catching as the scene unfolded before him. There, caught in a crude, vicious-looking snare made of twisted wire, was a small Sasquatch. A juvenile, no older than a human child of 8 or 9. Its leg was mangled, a red stain already spreading on its dark fur, and it struggled weakly against the cruel grip of the trap. Agony was etched on its small, intelligent face, its large eyes wide with terror and confusion. Overlooking the scene, just beyond a cluster of moss-covered boulders, were 2 enormous adult Sasquatch. Their forms were tense, their powerful bodies coiled, a low, guttural growl rumbling deep in their chests. They were distressed, agitated, pacing restlessly, their massive hands clenching and unclenching. They were torn, Thorn realized, between the instinct to protect their injured young and the deep-seated fear of human presence that centuries of violence had instilled. Thorn felt a cold dread wash over him, quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't an observation. It was a crisis. He was exposed, vulnerable, and directly in the line of sight of 2 incredibly powerful, highly agitated creatures. Their eyes, dark and piercing, were fixed on him, a silent, primal challenge. He felt the raw power emanating from them, the sheer force that could crush him in an instant. Every fiber of his being screamed to flee, to retreat into the safety of his cabin and the artificial distinctions of his human world. This was the moment his academic colleagues would have warned him against. The dangerous overstep into a realm best left alone. But then the juvenile whimpered again, a thin, heart-wrenching sound that cut through the fear. Thorn remembered his own family, lost to the wilderness and the profound guilt he carried, the unanswered questions that haunted his nights. He remembered the historical violence, the atrocities committed against these creatures, the very reason for their isolation. He saw the fear in the adult Sasquatch's eyes, the echoes of generations of trauma. He knew, with an absolute terrifying clarity, that he had a choice, a singular moment that would define everything he had worked for, everything he believed. Flee and confirm their deepest fears, leaving the young one to suffer and possibly die. Or risk everything, put his life on the line, and try to help. The choice, though terrifying, was clear. He had to help. Taking a slow, deliberate breath, Thorn let his field kit slide gently to the ground. He raised his hands slowly, palms open, a universal gesture of peace and non-aggression. He started speaking, his voice low, calm, filled with an empathy that transcended words. "Easy, easy," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the adults, acknowledging their presence, their power. "I'm not here to hurt anyone. I want to help the little one." He took a single, slow step forward, then another, his movements agonizingly deliberate. Every muscle in his body was screaming for him to stop, but he pushed past the fear. The adults watched, their growls deepening, a warning that vibrated through the very ground. Their sheer size was overwhelming, their raw strength palpable. One false move, one sudden gesture, and it would be over. He knelt slowly, keeping his hands visible, his movements fluid and non-threatening. The injured juvenile twitched, its eyes darting between him and its parents. Thorn spoke directly to it, his voice soothing, almost singing, the same lullabies he'd hummed near his offerings. "It's okay, little one. I'm going to help you." He reached for his first aid pouch, making sure his movements were exaggeratedly slow, allowing the adults to track his every intention. He pulled out a small bottle of antiseptic, bandages, and a pair of small cutters to deal with the snare. He could feel the intense, burning gaze of the adult Sasquatch on him. 1,000 questions and a lifetime of suspicion in their silent scrutiny. This was the ultimate test of his sincerity, a moment of profound, terrifying trust. He carefully, painstakingly, began to work on the snare. The profound stillness of the forest seemed to hold its breath as Thorn, kneeling beside the trapped juvenile, felt the immense weight of the adult Sasquatch's gazes upon him. The air thrummed with a primal energy, a cocktail of fear, hope, and an ancient, territorial instinct. He had expected a roar, a lunge, an immediate attack. But instead, there was only that terrifying, unwavering scrutiny. With painstaking slowness, his hands never faltering. Despite their trembling, he worked the crude wire snare from around the young creature's leg. The juvenile whimpered, a soft, almost human sound, and he whispered assurances, his voice barely audible even to himself. He cleaned the raw wound with antiseptic wipes he always carried, then gently wrapped it in sterile gauze, securing it with medical tape. All the while, the parents remained utterly motionless, massive shadows against the dense foliage, their eyes like ancient coals burning into his very soul. Finally, the task was done. Thorn stood, slowly, his hands held open, palms exposed in a gesture of peace and vulnerability. He backed away a few paces, giving them space. The injured juvenile, still dazed, tried to stand, then collapsed. Its mother, with a fluid grace that belied her immense size, moved forward. She nudged her child with her nose, a soft, inquiring sound emanating from deep within her chest. The father, a towering figure of silent power, shifted his weight, and a low rumble, deep and resonant, vibrated through the forest floor. A sound Thorn had only ever caught on distant recordings, now experienced in its raw, unfiltered presence. It wasn't aggressive, not a threat, but something else entirely. Perhaps acknowledgement, perhaps a final assessment. Then, with a coordinated movement that spoke of centuries of survival, the family turned. The mother gently guided the juvenile, supporting its weight while the father brought up the rear, his gaze lingering on Thorn for just another heart-stopping moment. They melted into the forest, disappearing as subtly as smoke, leaving Thorn alone in the sudden echoing silence. He stood there for a long time, the antiseptic smell on his hands, a stark contrast to the rich, earthy scent of the woods, his heart hammering against his ribs. He was shaken to his core, not just by the danger, but by the profound, almost spiritual weight of the interaction. He had not merely observed, he had intervened, and in doing so, had touched a raw nerve of a relationship that stretched back through forgotten time. He had bridged a tiny, fragile fragment of the chasm of distrust that humanity had carved. The walk back to his cabin was a blur. His mind raced, processing the sheer enormity of what had transpired. This wasn't just data, not just theory. It was a living, breathing connection, forged in a moment of shared vulnerability. He understood then, with an absolute, unshakable certainty, that his research was no longer merely scientific. It had transcended the academic, the empirical, and had become a mission of reconciliation, a sacred trust. He understood the immense responsibility he now carried, a burden and a privilege intertwined. He wouldn't, simply publish his findings, expose them to a world that had, for so long, been their persecutor. The secret of their continued existence, of their sentience, their memory, and their pain, had to be protected. The old wound, centuries deep, would not heal overnight, but he had offered a salve. His understanding of the Sasquatch had deepened beyond mere biological study. He now saw them as guardians of an ancient way, a living testament to humanity's capacity for both cruelty and compassion. He found himself thinking of his own family, wondering if they, too, had stumbled into a situation where a moment of fear or misunderstanding had led to tragedy. The thought brought a fresh wave of sorrow, but also a renewed resolve. Eris Thorne continued his solitary life in the cabin, but his days were now imbued with a different purpose. He became their silent guardian, an unsung ambassador in a forgotten war. He still placed offerings, not just food, but small, carefully crafted items that conveyed respect and an unspoken apology. He learned to track their movements, not to intrude, but to monitor for threats. The telltale signs of encroaching logging, the discarded remnants of poachers, the casual disregard of hikers. He used his knowledge of the forest and his subtle influence with local rangers to divert paths, to suggest preservation zones, always working from the shadows. He never sought public validation for his theories, for his encounters. The world wasn't ready, and to expose them was to endanger them further. His interactions became rarer, more subtle, but they were there. A carefully placed feather, a distinct vocalization carried on the wind that seemed specifically for him. A sense of being watched, not with wariness, but with a quiet, ancient acceptance. He had moved beyond simply studying Sasquatch. He was protecting them, trying to mend a wound that humanity had inflicted, one careful, hopeful step at a time. The forest, once a place of academic pursuit, had become his sanctuary, his responsibility, and his lifelong mission. The story was not one of discovery, but of rediscovery, a humbling lesson in humility and the enduring power of a memory. And so, Eris Thorne, the disillusioned primatologist, found his true purpose, forever bound to the silent, majestic beings of the deep woods who remembered, and who had, against all odds, begun to trust again. Thank you for joining us on Dr. Thorne's incredible journey into the heart of the wilderness and the mysteries it holds. If this story has sparked your imagination, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to check out our other videos for more intriguing tales of the unknown.